his name, made him famous, was Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which should be in here somewhere. Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. So this is back in '79. So he was young, this is really when neo-pragmatism comes back in. Plus, he opens up the door to European philosophers in America. He's part of the analytic tradition at this point, but this book is actually a criticism of the analytic tradition, and introduces really a new attachment to Dewey, John Dewey's work. So John Dewey, of course, was very influential in the United States, had influenced especially educational practices, and not simply in the United States, but worldwide. But as an analytic philosopher, he was not really part of that picture, as he didn't get into the study of language so much. He was really more of a straight-out Hegelian philosopher, if you think of it, right? And so he was kind of not taken seriously by the analytic folks who wanted to just do the kind of British analytic philosophy. That even Bertrand Russell said, that's not all of philosophy, so why on earth would you spend so much time just doing things like mathematical logic? Well, Quine did those. Quine is not so much the kind of general philosopher that gives you a philosophy of life. He focused on mathematical logic, making language understandable, trying to understand how we can be secure in our knowledge, of course. But he was a neo-pragmatist, and so is Richard Ward. So the goal is to understand how, on the one hand, we can be like Dewey, use the dialectical process to understand how we learn, and what's the best vocabulary for doing that. So what I thought I would do is read a section of one of his books. So this one is Objectivity, Relativism, and Truth, Philosophical Papers. And it's just volume 1, but I'm looking at the last article in the text. And part of what I'm hoping to show is that he's very readable. You can follow what he's talking about. He takes really difficult things and makes them easy to understand what he's talking about. So let me see this, and give me a holler, wave if you start to fall asleep, or if I'm boring you to death, and then I can stop and just go back to telling my own sort of jokes, etc. But so the title of this, and you should recognize a lot of the elements as he goes, because we've discussed them. Cosmopolitanism without emancipation, a response to Jean-Francois Lyotard. Lyotard was the French author that wrote the article about postmodernism. Okay, so in the form John Dewey gave it, and did I emphasize enough that he's the one that brought Dewey back into interest as a philosopher, as well as continental philosophy, so a lot of good things. Okay, so in the form John Dewey gave it, pragmatism is a philosophy tailored to the needs of political liberalism, a way of making political liberalism look good to persons with philosophical tastes. It provides a rationale for non-ideological, compromising, reformist muddling through what Dewey called experimentalism. It claims that categorical distinctions of the sort philosophers typically invoke are useful only so long as they facilitate conversation about what we should do next. Such distinctions, Dewey says, should be blurred or erased as soon as they begin to hinder such conversations, to block the road of inquiry. Dewey thinks that muddle, compromise, and blurry syntheses are usually less perilous politically than Cartesian clarity. That is one reason why his books are so often thought bland and boring, for he neither erects an exciting new binary opposition in terms of which to praise the good and damn the bad, nor does he distinguish between bad binary oppositions and some wonderful new form of discourse which will somehow avoid using any such oppositions, which is actually what the Europeans tend to do. He just urges us to be on our guard against using intellectual tools which were useful in a certain socio-cultural environment after that environment has changed, to be aware that we may have to invent new tools to cope with new situations. Dewey spent half his time debunking the very idea of human nature and of philosophical foundations for social thought, but he spent the other half spinning a story about universal history, a story of progress according to which contemporary movements for social reform within the liberal democracies are parts of the same overall movement as the overthrow of feudalism and the abolition of slavery. As I read this, I realize, that's a lot of the things I believe. But a lot of it's not politically correct today, actually, so it's a problem for me. Right? He offered a historical narrative in which American democracy is the embodiment of all the best features of the West, while at the same time making fun of what Jean-Francois Lyotard in his The Postmodern Condition has called meta-narratives. That's an issue for me because I still use those, even though he doesn't like that expression. Dewey thought that we could have a morally uplifting historical narrative without bothering to erect a metaphysical backdrop against which this narrative is played out, and without getting very specific about the goal towards which it tends. So I suppose that's the reason he doesn't like the concept of a meta-narrative, because he feels like it needs those other things. I'm pretty wishy-washy on that, so I feel like, well, if Dewey's going to have a historical narrative, that's what I mean by a meta-narrative. I don't feel that's a critique of it. Okay, but so followers of Dewey, like myself, would like to praise parliamentary democracy and the welfare state as very good things, but only on the basis of invidious comparisons with suggested concrete alternatives, not on the basis of claims that these institutions are truer to human nature or more rational or in better accord with the universal moral law than feudalism or totalitarianism. I'm thinking of, okay, we've just moved not only nationwide, but locally by electing Dewey. I don't know if you saw the paper this morning, but I'm reading the articles about the guy who killed the zoo gardener, and basically the analysis was this guy was a guy that was mentally ill, and the system just had no recourse. They kept putting him in jail for his violence, but then they analyzed him and said he's mentally ill, he's not able to stand trial. And so what did they do? Well, they sent him to API so that he could be fixed, so that he could come back and stand trial, but instead API says, nope, can't fix him, and so they release him. And then he, of course,
goes out and kills him.
Goes out and, well,
violence.
This was the first time he killed, so now that's, well, of course, we don't want to get to the point where, oh, okay, he killed somebody, now we have to really do something. But we want to figure out a way to get, before that. But I remember, if you remember, back in Reagan's day, one of the things Reagan tried to do was to save money by closing down places like API. We've got to do something else, bring these people into the community. Well, none of that ever actually worked. The end result of that was really prison for people that were mentally ill. So of course API is an institution that is an attempt to treat the mentally ill so that they don't have to be treated like prisoners. But we've been underfunding that. We don't even want to fund the prisons. We don't want to fund anything. Nobody wants to spend more money. Everyone wants to cut taxes. But that results in us not taking care of the mentally ill, not really taking care of prisoners. We're not really doing a good job with recidivism. And the trouble, of course, is all of these programs, even if they don't work, they still cost money. And the trouble is we don't want to spend the money, but at the same time we don't want to have these problems. But the fact of it is, in a human situation, you can't get rid of these problems. So, welfare state. Basically, if you think of it, what he's saying is, I like, parliamentary democracy. Well, he means not only that, but the kind of democracy we have, and the welfare state. These are very good things. They're not. They don't actually solve the problems, but they're better than the alternatives, as he says, right? And the thing is, well, the welfare state does cost money, and apparently we've resolved, at least by votes, that we don't want to fund the welfare state. We're pulling out of it. But that's presenting us with no real alternative that's, traditionally morally good. What are we going to do with that? Like Lyotard, I'll continue reading. We want to stop, or rather to drop, meta-narratives. Unlike him, we keep on spinning edifying first-order narratives. So that strikes me as contradictory, because I think of these edifying first-order narratives as meta-narratives. So this is just a puzzle over. Oh, what does he mean? So why is he upset with Francois Lyotard? So the pragmatist answer to the question Lyotard raises in his Universal History and Cultural Differences. So they had a conference. There were a lot of essays writing back and forth, and he was part of that, and Lyotard was too. So that's what precipitated this specific article, right? So basically, I think he and Lyotard are actually more in agreement than not. But when you're writing an article, you've got to say something about the other person, right? So the pragmatist answer to the question Lyotard raises in his Universal History and Cultural Differences, which is his article, can we continue to organize the events? This is Lyotard, so it's a quote. Can we continue to organize the events which crowd in upon us from the human and non-human worlds with the help of the idea of a universal history of humanity, unquote. That's from his Histoire Universelle et Différences Culturelles, etc. Is that, okay, so back to Rorty, is that we can and should, as long as the point of doing so is to lift our spirits through utopian fantasy, rather than to gird our loins with metaphysical weapons. So that's kind of odd. What's he mean by utopian fantasy? We Deweyians have a story to tell about the progress of our species, a story whose latter episodes emphasize how things had been getting better in the West during the last few centuries, and which concludes with some suggestions about how they might become better still in the next few. But when asked about cultural differences, about what our story has to do with the Chinese or the Keshinawa, and I had to look them up, they're so he's basically juxtaposing big culture, very great impact, and a little tiny Aboriginal group in Peru, basically, right? About a couple thousand people, the Keshinawa. I mention them constantly as We can only reply that for all we know, intercourse with these people may help modify our Western ideas about what institutions can best embody the spirit of Western social democracy. And by the way, whenever he says that, I think about, well, what about local natives here in Alaska, and the culture? What can we get in that intercourse, which obviously he means dialectical speech, not biological intercourse. Sorry about that. You probably didn't need to know that, but okay. So, we look forward in a vague way to a time when the Kashinua, the Chinese, and, if such there be, I love this, the planets which form the galactic empire will all be part of the same cosmopolitan social democratic community. This community will doubtless have different institutions than those to which we are presently accustomed, but we assume that these future institutions will incorporate and enlarge the sorts of reforms which we applaud our ancestors for having made. The Chinese, the Kashinua, and the Galactics will doubtless have suggestions about what further reforms are needed, but we shall not be inclined to adopt these suggestions until we have managed to fit them in with our distinctively Western social democratic aspirations, though through some sort of judicious give and take. This sort of ethnocentrism, we like what we like, we don't want to change that unless you convince us, right? Is, we pragmatists think, inevitable and unobjectionable. It amounts to little more than the claim that people can rationally change their beliefs and desires only by holding most of those beliefs and desires constant, even though we can never say in advance just which are to be changed and which remain intact, retained intact. Rationally here means that one can give a retrospective account of why one changed, how one invoked old beliefs or desires in justification of the new ones, rather than having to say helplessly, it just happened, somehow I got converted. We don't want to say that. We want to have like a rational explanation for why we changed our mind. We cannot leap outside our Western social democratic skins when we encounter another culture, and we should not try. All we should try to do is to get inside the inhabitants of that culture long enough to get some idea of how we look to them, and whether they have any ideas we can use. That is all. That is also all they can be expected to do on encountering us. If members, so think about, the Islamic migrants into Europe, the native Alaskan migrating into Anchorage, the migrants from Honduras trying to get into the United States. I mean, any of that, right? If members of the other culture protest that this expectation of tolerant reciprocity is a provincially Western one, and it is, right? We can only shrug our shoulders and reply that we have to work by our own lights, even as they do, for there is no supercultural observation platform to which we might repair. The only common ground on which we can get together is that defined by the overlap between their communal beliefs and desires and our own. So this is, for example, a real issue in the Islamists moving into Europe, because the French require them. They're tolerant. They're tolerant of their arrival, but they expect within a couple of years for them to become French. In other words, they're going to have to abandon their Islamic beliefs. That's not clearly stipulated, but it's understood by the French. But the Islamists that come in absolutely feel that the French are wrong, that secularism is wrong, and that everyone ought to become Islamic, and that they even feel that eventually France will be so overwhelmed with Islamic people from these migrations that France will become Islamic, and as far as they're concerned, saved. So you've got a real conflict of interest here between the French who expect the Islamists to become French and there's the Islamists who expect the French to become Islamic, right? Oh, no, it can't work both ways, right? And, of course, my sympathies are with the French, because I think, that's more like us. I mean, I don't want to become Islamic myself, or my alternative is, or death. I'd rather have cake, please. Sorry. Monty Python. Or that's actually Eddie's. So, is this good? You get the idea? It's good writing. It's a really good article, but as you can see, I'm still that many pages to go. But it is good, So this sort of ethnocentrism, we think, etc. It's all the. Okay, so the pragmatist utopia is thus not one in which human nature has been unshackled, but one in which everybody has had a chance to suggest ways in which we might cobble together a world or galactic society, and in which all such suggestions have been thrashed out in free and open encounters. We pragmatists do not think that there is a natural moral kind coextensive with our biological species, one which binds together the French, the Americans, and the Chinois. But we nevertheless feel free to use slogans like Tennyson's, the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, for we want narratives of increasing cosmopolitanism though not narratives of emancipation. This is a conflict he has with Lyotard. Remember, he's responding to an article by Lyotard. So. And I won't get into the conflict with Lyotard, because basically we would agree with both of them. It's just specifics in how you would phrase it, I think, where the two of them are actually in difference. So I'll stop reading that. Was that fun though? Do you like that kind of stuff? Do you ever read that kind of stuff? Like, you're still in college, so you still have to read everything that you're assigned, and you never have time to do your own. Sorry about that. It'd be nice, of course, if you became philosophy majors, then you could do that reading as like, well, that's your assigned reading. But, so what else is interesting? This was one of the first books of his I read that was really impressive. Irony, contingency. Everything is contingent, and that's kind of ironic, because it shouldn't be. But somehow we have to have solidarity in order for us to do anything. So of course this is all a problem with regard to our current political state of affairs. I'm sure he would feel that, because everything being contingent meant that the populist point of view is what has currently won. Same thing here. So we have a lot of the local intelligentsia that basically feel this is going to be really bad, because a perfect example of this, if you read the paper today, the head of API refuses to turn in his I quit, as required, please hire me back, and I submit to your, taking the reins of leadership kind of thing, because his actual argument is no, I don't like your ideas. Because all I've heard so far is that you want to cut things, and that's exactly what's wrong with API, is that you guys haven't paid for everything you need, which, let's see if I can. So here's the article. Maybe this isn't the one where he's. Maybe I'm mixing my articles. I think I'm mixing my articles. This is probably it. So he's asked all these folks to submit their resignation by November 30th. It's not everybody, of course, but it's a lot more people than are usually asked to do that. And so let me see if I can find. So here he is. So one high-ranking state official, Anthony Blanford, the director of psychiatry at the Alaska Psychiatric Institute, has publicly refused to sign the resignation letter. In a letter published Monday in the Daily News, Blanford said he had a problem with offering Dunleavy a symbolic gesture of deference. I can't say I'm in favor of further cuts and hiring freezes because that's not what's needed at API at this time. And that's the only plan I've heard so far. The state of Alaska hired me for my expertise, not my political allegiance, he continued. My moral allegiance is to the mentally ill and the staff who care for them. So, when we look at the current political state of affairs, I would say he's an example of the elite, the educated elite, and he's convinced that a solution to the situation, keep in mind that the people that would get more money if his argument is followed would include him. So that seems blatantly biased in that sense, right? But nonetheless, the argument would be that the state has to pay more to the welfare state instead of less. But what the voting actually in our state was pretty heavily in favor of Dunleavy. Dunleavy won by more than 10 points, I think, right? And his main argument for everyone was, vote for me and you'll get $6,700. Yeah, okay, feed me, you know, greed, right? No offer of vote for me and I'll make sure that you all pay more taxes so that we can pay the welfare state more. No, that's not the way we voted, right? There were some that voted for that, but it was pretty heavily against that. Although I notice in a lot of states, things were nip and tuck, really, if you noticed. And some obviously said, yes, let's pay more money for the welfare. And I'm using the concept of welfare as he is in this article, and that means not just food stamps or something, but all of the programs, right? By the way, I can see people like Charles Murray's critique of those programs to point out that when you have the state funding those programs, they tend to make the situation worse, right? So if you look at Charles Murray, and it's, well, Coming Apart would be one, but Losing Ground was the earlier book. So notice it's 1984, right? But this was a significant book because the data showed that the Great Society legislation that resulted not just from Kennedy, but really from LBJ, right, ended up statistically, seemingly, a way of interpreting this is that the more welfare support there is for people that don't have jobs or at the bottom, the worse their situation gets because they tend to become culturally dependent on handouts. Is that right? So if you want to improve the situation, what you really need to do is encourage the needy to earn their own keep. And you're fighting against human nature, because it's our nature to be lazy. Unless we're encouraged by misery to do better, to improve our own situation. I remember my wife, our whole married life, she's always been worried that she might end up a bag lady. I've always joked that without her, I'd end up, living under a bridge somewhere as a drunk monk or something. Actually, kind of a euphoric, imaginary for me. But in any case, between the two of us, of course, we've done fine. But there's always been that worry of, if you don't get up in the morning and you don't show up at class, no matter what the excuse, sorry about the traffic, etc., right? that you're not going to keep yourself from being in that horrible situation, right? So you've got to earn the money. Otherwise, well, hey, the easier thing to do is just stay home. And a lot of people do that. One of the employers' complaints is that the hardest thing to do is to find people that will come to work and actually show up and be on time regularly, right? A lot of people, they just feel, oh, I'll call in, I don't feel good this morning. But you can't run a business that way, right? I don't want to take just Rorty's side here and say that we need a welfare state because that's the nice way to be, when we might say that since the LBJ years, our society tried that, and the more it tried that, the more money it put into that, the more it discovered that the problem became. It clearly ends up looking like the infrastructure doesn't solve these social problems. In fact, all the infrastructure, the bureaucracy does is grow itself, and so it becomes more and more expensive, and the problem grows and grows. So the response to that, of those that voted against it and continue to do so, might have physics as its basis. You can't argue with physics. I mean, physics is one of those points, where the socially constructed reality touches on the reality that absolutely is adamantly against our doing. I want to put this book in the air. Just stay there. Oh, it won't. Why not? Mind over matter. No, it doesn't work. We should spend enough money that we don't have any mentally ill people. Well, guess what? That's the same thing, or even worse, is trying to hold this book up in the air just by willpower, right? You're not gonna solve the problem as Reagan always used to say, by throwing money at it. Right? Government is the problem, right? In other words, government was making things worse by having all of those programs and taking everybody's money to support it. So, that's always been an interesting puzzle. How do you know which way things go? But we've definitely been moving in the opposite direction. And by the way, if you're thinking of the Obama period as more liberal, what's odd is President Nixon, who was considered a conservative Republican, actually voted for more liberal legislation than Obama did. So our conception of what a liberal is has been moving to the right in lots of ways, actually. by the way, a lot of people consider Trump to be very liberal in some things. Like his attempt just the other day, and it's an ongoing attempt to get a hold of the prices of medicines and stop them from charging outrageous amounts for medicines in our country, when you could go and look at what they charge in other places and they're much cheaper. And you know, of course, all along the conservative point of view is pro-business, funded by lobbyists who were funded by the medical corporations to let the medical corporations have a monopoly on the medicine and charge thousands of dollars for a month's worth of the medicine that people need.
To stay alive.
To stay alive, yes. So, you know, whoa, you know, but, you know, how much does it actually cost to that? The hell with that, as far as the company is concerned. We want profits, because I need my boat payments, right?
Yeah.
I need my, you know, my 3 estates, you know, funded, you know, with all the servants that I have. I'm helping employment by hiring, you know, 20 people to run my yacht, you know.
Yeah.
You know, full-time people, they're there even if I'm not yachting myself, you know. So I'm helping employment by charging $10,000 a dose of this medicine.
Hi, I'm Paul. I switched to Sprint.
I didn't want you to meet Paul, but if we let Paul talk for another minute or two. Oh, I can skip it. I can skip it. Sorry. So this is word.
Pragmatists say we should stop thinking in Greek terms, not think of in terms of a distinction between appearance and reality, or between mind and body, or between intellect and sense, but think of ourselves in the wake of Darwin as what Nietzsche called clever